Did you know that by the end of this event, 3 men in the UK will have died by suicide? I can still remember exactly where I was when my dad called me to tell me that they found my uncle. He had taken his life, and it had taken 3 weeks to find his body. Richard was 47. He was a doctor, super smart, creative, artistic. He spoke new languages with ease. He played and wrote music, and he understood science and maths like no one else I knew. He was the kind of kid you'd really hate at school, right? He saved people's lives for a living, and yet he decided to take his own. I'd like to take you back to 2010. I was at my new flat in Brighton having dinner with a friend, about to start my 3rd year of university, when my dad calls me to tell me that they found my uncle. That feeling, that sinking feeling in your stomach when your heart drops all the way down, and all you can think is, what could I have done to stop that from happening? That feeling is not something I wish anyone ever has to experience. Men are facing a crisis. How many men do you think die by suicide each day in the UK? Have a guess. Raise your hand if you think it's under 5. Raise your hands. Under 5? Under 10? It's 12. That's 1 man every 2 hours. While we're all enjoying our day, we're going to lose 12 men to suicide today. In my work, we talk a lot about the fact that 76% of all suicides are male, and that this silent killer is claiming the lives of more men under 45 than anything else. And I can't help but find myself asking, why is that? Doesn't that trouble you? Because it troubles me. These are our brothers, fathers, uncles, partners, sons. These are our friends, and they decide to die. I think there are some hard questions we need to ask about male suicide. I don't believe there is anything wrong with men having suicidal thoughts. But is there something wrong with how we react to suicide being thought about? Let me explain. We'll all die at one point or another, right? Our bodies will fail us and we'll die of disease or old age. Or we'll have our lives taken from us, maybe in a tragic accident. So, isn't it perfectly normal to consider being in control of our own death? Yes, suicide is intentional, but does that automatically make it wrong? I believe suicide is preventable, and I believe we should do everything in our power to prevent it. But I also believe there's nothing inherently wrong in thinking about our own death. I've considered what it's like to die. I'd like to ask you all to close your eyes just for a minute. I promise nothing scary will happen if you close your eyes. Now raise your hands if you've ever had a really bad day that's left you feeling maybe stressed or upset. Okay, keep your eyes closed and keep your hands raised if that bad day or bad week or bad month has ever led you to think about harming yourself or taking your own life. Thank you. Put your hands down and then open your eyes. That was about half of this room. I invite you to consider what might be different if we didn't see having suicidal thoughts as wrong, and what that might mean for the men in our lives thinking of suicide. Let's go back to my Uncle Richard. For most of his life, he experienced what was most likely bipolar, and he had suicidal thoughts on more than one occasion. In fact, 6 years before his death, he attempted to take his life. The sad fact was that Richard lived in a time where suicide wasn't considered something that you spoke about. It was swept under the carpet and a cause of shame amongst families. There was something wrong with it. I mean, it was only in 1961 that we stopped making suicide a crime. Richard's parents were medics, an anaesthetist and a nurse, and they didn't understand suicide either. They didn't think that it was real, and I think they were probably in denial about what was happening with Richard. What happened to my uncle isn't my grandparents' fault. Suicide is complex and rarely attributed to any one factor. But when I reflect on Richard's experience and on how we still struggle to speak about suicide today, nothing's really changed. We still struggle to talk about it. We label it as abnormal or unusual, and we make men wrong for having suicidal thoughts. We say that they're unwell or that they need to get better. And because we think of it this way, it stops us from being able to talk about it, and we stay silent instead. And suicide remains shrouded in this stigma. That stigma is only perpetuated by irresponsible and sensationalized journalism that happens in the cases of celebrity suicide. Just look at some of the reporting around Anthony Bourdain's recent death. When I was thinking about how best to explain this point, it made me think about sex and sex education. Stick with me, okay? It's really uncomfortable for us to talk to kids about sex. It's so tempting to think, if we don't talk about it, it won't happen, our kids won't have sex. But we know that teenage pregnancy and STIs are the risks if we don't have that conversation. And we take those risks seriously. We introduce sex education into schools, and it's now compulsory across the UK. And I mean, it's far from perfect. But what it has been shown to do is to improve positive attitudes towards safe sex, to delay sex, and to reduce teenage pregnancy when used alongside other methods. With suicide, we know it's a myth that talking about it will plant that idea in someone's head. And if suicide is claiming the lives of more men under 45 than anything else, isn't it time we just start accepting that suicidal thoughts are something that happen, and instead start talking openly and responsibly about it? I don't think there is anything wrong with men having suicidal thoughts. But perhaps there is something wrong with our expectations of men in society that lead them to have those thoughts. Let's think about that. What does it mean to be masculine? What does it mean to be a man? Society tells us men should be strong, dependable, and able to provide for their family. There's very little research into the reasons why men suicide, but the recent research that does exist speaks about how men's high suicide rates are linked to risk factors such as history of being abused as a child, single status or relationship breakdown, and financial difficulty or unemployment. So that means that if you're a man and you've had a troubled childhood, you're still searching for the one, or you're worried about money, you're at risk of suicide. How many of us know men in that situation? I mean, I've definitely just described Richard, and I've probably described half of millennial men in the UK. Unsurprisingly, these risk factors are linked to those traditional notions of masculinity, of being strong, dependable, and able to provide for your family. It seems as though when men feel they can't meet those expectations, they make themselves wrong for that. The research backs this up too. Just last year, there was a paper confirming that there is a link between men feeling unable to fulfill the stereotypical characteristics of masculinity and suicidal thoughts. Now, I imagine a lot of us in this room don't agree with those stereotypes, but some of us probably do, or at least know someone who does. How many of us have been guilty of saying man up at some point in our lives? I know I have. The conversation is starting to change. There are great campaigns like BBC Three's Real Men Do Cry and Calm's Ludicrous that are trying to shift those perceptions of men and masculinity and encourage them to be more open and vulnerable. But is it just men who are perpetuating these outdated stereotypes of what it means to be a man and making themselves wrong for that? I don't think so. I'd like us to consider what our role is as women. Just last month, I was chatting to a female friend of mine who described the guy she was dating as a sponge and too sensitive because he opened up to her about some of the anxieties he was facing in the relationship and how that was making him feel vulnerable. I cannot begin to describe the look I see on some women's faces when I speak about how men I know have broken down in tears in front of me. It's somewhere between discomfort and disdain. Men are already making themselves wrong for not living up to these masculine ideals of being strong, dependable, and able to provide for their families. They're already shaming themselves for that. Are we compounding the problem by making men wrong and shaming them for demonstrating those open and vulnerable behaviors that we say we want them to show us? Are we making men wrong for breaking out of these rigid stereotypes and for just being fully human? To the women in the room, I'm not saying that male suicide is our responsibility. I absolutely acknowledge that men have a huge role to play in breaking down these stereotypes. But as a woman, I can only speak to my experience and how I do see our role. What I'm inviting all of us to do, regardless of our gender, is to reconsider the expectations that we have of men in society and reconsider how we view men who have the courage to show us their vulnerability. I'm inviting us to ask the men in our lives how they're really doing and if they're struggling with anything they haven't told us about. And can we think about how we respond to that? How we might choose to empathize with their pain? Can we hold space for men and listen to them without trying to fix things? Tell them that we love them and that it's okay for them to feel however they're feeling. I'd like to tell you about another guy I know. He's a really good friend of mine. I used to work with him, actually. His name's Billy. He's super smart. He's genuine, authentic, kind, generous. He's just the kind of guy you really want to spend time with. So imagine how I felt when Billy called me at 11:30 a.m. on a Friday morning 3 years ago to tell me that he spent the night in hospital because the night before he tried to take his own life. He was 24. You're probably thinking I felt shocked, panicked, uncomfortable. Actually, I felt honored. I felt honored that Billy felt that he could talk to me about his suicide attempt and how he'd been feeling. I thought back to my uncle, and I knew that I had a chance to respond differently to Billy. I met him with compassion and understanding and a safe space to talk about how he was feeling, without judgment. I didn't make him wrong for feeling the way that he felt or for attempting to take his life. I didn't try to label him as suicidal or as someone who needed to get better. I simply gave him a space to talk about whatever he needed to. I saw what he told me as incredibly courageous and not something he should ever be ashamed of. I can't help but wonder if this can make a difference. When I reflect on how my response to Billy was entirely different to the response my uncle used to receive when he spoke about suicide, I can't help but wonder what would happen if we had different expectations of men in society, if we had a different reaction to men who have the courage to show us their vulnerability, and a different reaction to men who have suicidal thoughts. Would men feel differently about suicide? I don't have the answers, but I am inviting you to consider the questions. Because I don't believe there is anything wrong with men having suicidal thoughts. But perhaps there is something wrong with how we react to that and our expectations of men in society. So what would happen if we all had the courage to go home tonight and have conversations with the men in our lives about how they're feeling and what they're thinking, including their suicidal thoughts? Yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable. I get that. But we do it with sex. Every parent dreads having that conversation with their kids about how babies are made. But we know it's important to keep our kids safe. So we do it anyway, no matter how uncomfortable we feel. I wish I could have had a conversation with my uncle like the one I had with Billy. I wish I could have told him, there is nothing wrong with you. There is nothing wrong with how you're feeling or what you're thinking. It's okay. I'm here to listen to whatever you need to say or talk about. Because your feelings are important. You're important. And you don't have to do this alone. Thank you.